God's Creatures is a joint A24 BBC and Fish Aaron joint production, directed by Sarah Davis and Anna Rose Homer, of a screenplay by Shane Crowley. The story sees Paul Mescal's Brian return home from Australia mysteriously out of the blue. He deflects any questions about why as you start to get a sense that there's more to the story. Brian is a divisive figure, even within his own family unit. You sense that his sister and his father have a fair read on him, but he's very much the stereotypical Irish mammy's boy. Enter Emily Watson's Aileen, the archetypal Irish mammy who would do anything for her son and refuses to see a bad bone in his body, despite some evidence to the contrary. Their relationship is uncomfortably close. It's almost romantic in nature at times. They're extremely tactile with each other and share constant, long, lingering looks. They play with a similar kind of love can be toxic theme that we're seeing a lot this year, most notably recently perhaps in The Last of Us. Brian tries to pick up where he left off in the coastal fishing community, for better or worse, until after a night in the pub with his mother, accusations from a family friend emerge of horrific sexual violence from Brian, putting Aileen in a near impossible situation as she's asked by a Garda to confirm if she was with Brian at home that night as an alibi. Eagle-eared viewers will note that the Garda doesn't actually tell her the date of the night in question. He just asks, "This is what Brian's saying, do you want to back it up?" And she makes a decision and things unfold from there. God's Creatures, like Brian, is divisive in itself. The movie seems to be splitting critics and audience, and for me, I see both sides. The closest recent comparison for reference you can make with this movie for me would be On Colleen Kuhn, which obviously deals with hugely different themes, but shares that rural setting that relies upon to drive the story. However, where On Colleen Kuhn captures Irish culture so deftly, matter-of-factly, and succinctly in a way that you feel like you can smell the kitchen or you can taste the lunch that they've just made, God's Creatures feels a little forced and try-hard in this respect at times. There are times, for example, when I'm going to be honest, it's just a bit boring. Like, we follow Brian doing general fishing tasks with no context or explanation. And I think we're supposed to infer at certain times that he's doing bad fishing things. But again, if you don't know, and if you're not a fisherman or you haven't fished or you haven't lived in these kind of rural fishing coastal towns, there's nothing really gained here. And it just comes across as the movie desperately wanting to feel authentic and lived in for the sake of it. And that's fine, but you also still do need to be a movie. You still do need to drive the plot, and you still do somehow need to let me know what's actually happening so I can know how to feel when the serious bits kick in. The dialogue also felt a bit forced and unnatural in contrast to that authentic vibe that they were aiming for. One character in particular seems to only speak lyrically, and one line I took of note that'll kind of demonstrate this is when they were saying he could be brutal with his words, but he's still the same as anyone really. We're all God's creatures in the dark, which again, if you're a fan of the likes of Cinema Sins, you probably hear that and go, roll credits. If someone said that to me though, if someone's like, he could be brutal with his words, but we're all God's creatures in the dark, if they said that to me in the context that it was said, which is they're on a smoke break outside an oyster factory where they work, I'd just be like, are you all right, pal? Is everything okay there? It's a movie that feels extremely at home, dealing with the nuances of the fishing community. Like, it really digs in deep there. Like, if you're a fisherman and you want to feel seen, go watch this movie. It'll really, I imagine that it's quite a faithful retelling of what day-to-day existence is like. But then it feels a bit lightweight with the actual dramatic tension and subject matter, and it feels really lacking when it comes to dealing with sexual violence. Instead, to try compensate for the lack of stuff that they have on the page, they rest a bit eye-rollingly on the, to be honest, on A24 tropes. Like, do you know when A24 movies, and you can probably see this type of scene if you've seen a few of them, where they'll have something mundane happening and happy, like someone singing or something like that, but they linger long enough on the character who's doing so to suggest a kind of tension and menace under the surface. So someone's like, my young love said to me, but then you're like, dun 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 dun, dun. Sound effects in the background. It's like, oh, this happy moment, there's actually evil. And all of that is not to say that it's a bad movie. It's not. Paul Mescal, for example, and I went to see this, the main draw for me was, oh, Paul Mescal isn't playing nice, likable, vulnerable for the first time. We get to see what he's like as a bad guy. And he actually does excellent here. He toes a very difficult line in showing the menace that can lurk beneath that kind of, sure, it's all a bit of crack, sure, don't be worried about it demeanor that everyone in Ireland is familiar with. He never plays Brian as overtly evil or threatening, which would have been the easy choice to make. Instead, we see him, if anything, an outwardly caring and kind kind of a good lad that you'd be described in as the community. But there's that kind of unmissable, you'll know it when you see it, ever-present kind of manipulative dark streak that Emily Watson remains willfully blind to. Another aspect that I really liked was the story's absolute refusal to commit to a time period. Aside from the odd context clue, we've no real indicator if this took place 20 years ago or in a present-day rural part of Ireland that's just stuck in a different time. And truthfully, the reality is when you get to the subject at hand, it makes no difference either way. There is a great story to be told here, and with the themes that they've tackled, like the toxicity of a parent's unconditional love, or how the lads in a rural Irish community are kind of a protected species, or how if we're incapable of kind of navigating challenging subjects and having an honest conversation and kind of looking honestly at the actions of people that we care about and we want to see as a good lad, how that can lead to people not being held to account, and it can also lead to victims just being destroyed. And I admire God's creatures attempting to do so. I just felt that it missed the mark a little bit. For example, I understand why they didn't give the accuser much of a voice throughout, but even so, making the story about the internal strife that Emily Watson's character was going through feels kind of like they made her the victim of the whole story in a tone-deaf manner that suggests this is a movie trying to understand the issues of play, but the people writing it don't actually fully do so themselves. It reminds me a little bit of, if you remember the Game of Thrones controversy where Sansa at one stage was raped, but the camera chose to focus on Theon Greyjoy watching it and being horrified by it. And while obviously you could tell the directors and writers' point of view was they didn't want us to have to see that horrific scene, but also the way that they focused it on him and how he suffered made it feel like he was the victim of the whole thing. And that's kind of the same way where there is a very obvious victim and there's a very obvious person who isn't a victim and actually isn't that sympathetic either. But because we're focusing on their struggles and their purview, it just would seem a bit tone deaf to anyone who may be triggered by the subject matter. I also wasn't really crazy about how the story of Aileen and Brian ended without saying much. It didn't feel true to the characters for a story that, again, if you're going to pride yourself and work so hard to be authentic and lived in this real community, again, spending so much time trying to teach us about fishing, then your character decisions have to be authentic and fall within that, or it's not going to work. On balance, though, if you are a Paul Mescal fan or the story does interest you in some of the things I've discussed, I'd still say go see this, but do temper your expectations. It's not a perfect movie by any means, but it is really interesting. And even kind of living in the subject matter it discusses will open your eyes and get your brain working in a way that I think it's healthy for us to start doing more often. That's God's Creatures, and it's in cinemas now.